remaining part of Vale Atque Ave. Subheading: Exceptions to non-comparability. There has been an intermittent tendency among historians and philosophers of science during the century just past to make two partial truths into absolutes. The first is that all systems of thought inevitably rest on assumptions that are formally arbitrary, which is correct. Note: thus, in one formulation of mathematical logic, the system is based on true and false applied to atomic propositions, a universal propositional calculus connective such as neither nor, quantification, the idea of all, and some suitably circumscribed notion of the membership of an element in a set. See Quine 1951 and also 1963 for a demonstration that such foundations are not unique. End of note. And that therefore any one such system is just as objectively correct as any other, which is misleading in its unstated implications. It is not the case that anything goes, to quote Feyerabend's celebrated, if not entirely intelligible phrase. Note: Lakatos and Feyerabend, 1999, pages 14, 116 and 324. End of note. From a historian's point of view at least, different systems of thought and practice have different behaviours and different capacities for particular types of action, and distinguishing between them is the essence of his work, just as a biologist distinguishes between species and their behaviours. The second partial truth is that cultural systems of belief, value, conception and perception are independent worlds of mutually interdetermining parts whose separate components cannot meaningfully be compared with their apparent counterparts in other systems. Anyone who has lived a substantial part of his life in different cultures is aware that this is not without its measure of truth, and that people in different societies do tend to live in what I have elsewhere called complexes of different stories. Note: Elvin, 1997, end of note. But there are subsets of effectively identical phenomena that can be common to two or more such societies, and where right or wrong answers have to be effectively identical. These subsets have the useful property of permitting precise comparisons, even if it is necessary to be cautious about delimiting them. There are normally cultural penumbrae around the subsets that are indeed significantly different. Where China and Europe are concerned, during the period, broadly speaking, from 500 to 1700 AD, the most useful such subset is probabilistic thinking relating to gambling, particularly with dice. The crucial analytical importance of probabilistic thinking for many general issues in the early history of science has been on the whole poorly appreciated by historians of science. It is also one of the domains where the divide between so-called science, in the sense of loosely explicit abstract theoretical conceptualization, and so-called technology, in the sense of loosely concrete practice. A commonplace that becomes questionable when looked at in terms of the tendency toward the close interrelationship in the styles of thinking and action that prevail in a given society at a given time, is blurred to the all but invisible. In the probabilistic domain, the adequacy of conceptualization is constantly being tested by repeated experiments, such as throwing dice or using other aleatoric devices, such as the Sung dynasty practice of commercial gaming for prizes by means of darts being thrown in quasi-random fashion at a revolving circular target subdivided into different areas, the physical analogue of a subdivided probability space. In the pre-modern Chinese case, when it is contrasted with early modern Europe, the study of probabilistic thinking also shows that the factors commonly instanced as external causes in Europe, commercialization, monetization, widespread numeracy, and the like, are useless as criteria of differentiation. They were all present in China. We can accept them as probably necessary preconditions, but not as sufficient ones. Internal criteria present different but equally tough problems. The Chinese tradition had more than sufficient skill with the arithmetic of fractions required for the analysis of probabilities. There was some familiarity with permutations, most generally in the case of the 2 to the 6th power equals 64 possible sequences of 6 unbroken or broken lines in the hexagram of the Book of Changes. The 3 to the power 361 possible arrangements of black and white counters and empty spaces on the 19 by 19 intersections of the Go board, famously established in principle by Shen Kuo, would not have been as well known, but show the capacity of Chinese mathematical culture to come up with the appropriate formula. In late imperial times, there was likewise a basic familiarity with combinations, most evidently in the systematically tabulated sets of all possible distinct scoring patterns from throwing 5 six-sided dice without considering the order of occurrence of individual values. Note, Elvin, 2000, end of note. Putting these three together would have yielded a basic calculus of probabilities, in all likelihood a lucrative discovery for its discoverer. It is also virtually certain, by deduction from the values used, that, at least by late imperial times, the exact relation between stakes, probabilities of outcomes, and payoffs was grasped by the professionals running certain gambling games, such as Fan Tan, a version of a very ancient amusement called by many other names, such as Lay Out the Coins, Fan Tian, summarized below. Probably to safeguard valuable trade secrets, the figures were never published, and so the codification, generalization, and progress usually associated with public availability never occurred. But there appears to have been no internal, that is, conceptual barrier to taking another step. Analogously, by the 4th century or earlier, the Chinese had some notion of what we would today regard as a statistical distribution, usually imagining it in a bureaucratic context, such as the unequal burden of labour service obligations on different areas, such as carrying taxed grain for different distances. So far as we know, however, they devoted themselves only to methods for calculating how to remove the inequalities as part of administrative fair practice, not to their analytical definition. Thus, while they knew how to interpolate a mean value between two extrema, they had no idea, then or later, of characterizing a statistical distribution by means of its variance and other measures. Note, I bid. End of note. To date, neither mainstream historians of Western science nor specialists in the pre-modern Chinese variety have realized just how great are the difficulties which the considerations outlined in this and the preceding paragraph make for their favoured explanatory frameworks. This is one of the few scientific topics with which Needham did not, so far as I know, concern himself, though he opened the door to us by even thinking of pursuing such an inquiry in a Chinese context. This is testimony to the continuing vitality of the project and the way it continues to impinge on the broader discipline of the history of science as a whole. The elusive history of clues to the presence of probabilistic thinking in pre-modern China is too complex to be pursued further here, but what can be said by way of a summary of the present position is that two main points seem to have emerged. The first is that in terms of what made its way into the public domain, the apparent stopping point is baffling. All the basic conceptual tools were there in a highly appropriate socio-economic setting, but nothing further happened. The second is that there are numerous indications that unpublished investigations, even if possibly only of an empirical or tabulatory sort, must have gone considerably further when one is looking at some of the details in the scoring system in the milfoil stalk oracle casting technique used in association with the Book of Changes, at the operations of professional gamblers, or the gambling selling methods of Sung dynasty shopkeepers. Note, Those interested in pursuing this topic should consult my unpublished paper, Elvin 2000, which is on deposit with a short bibliography in the library of the Needham Research Institute at 8 Sylvester Road, Cambridge, England, and available to anyone who contacts the librarian. End of note. Simply as an illustration of the type of information from which this unpublished capacity can be deduced is the family of coin games that culminated in late imperial times as Fantan, already alluded to and summarized here in a separate box. Box headed Practical Knowledge of Probabilities. The commonest type of coin game was probably that known as Lay Out the Coins, Tan Jian. It had other names, Mind Money, Yi Qian, Guess Numbers, Shi Shu, and Tricky Estimate, Koi Yi, among them. In the late 19th century, it was the basis for Fantan, played in state-supported dens to provide finance for the Navy. By this late date at least, the game was played as follows. An arbitrary quantity of copper coins was drawn at random from a heap, called the cash surface, Qian Pi, and put into a receptacle, Tan Chong. The participants then laid bets on the residue that would remain when the contents were counted off by fours. Thus 30, which is 4 times 7 plus 2, would leave a remainder of 2. There were thus 4 possibilities, or gates, mun, 1, 2, 3 and 4, or 0, taken as a cycle for ordering. There were 4 types of wager. 1, fan, betting on a single number. The payoff for success was the stake back plus 3 times the stake. 2, yen, or zhen, betting on 2 adjacent numbers, one of which was the principal and the other the support. If the winning number was the principal, the payoff was the stake back plus 2 times the stake. If the support was the number that came up, the stake was returned. 3, chow, betting on 2 adjacent numbers. If either was the number that came up, the payoff was the stake back plus 1 times the stake. Cheng, betting on 3 sequential numbers, the one in the middle being the principal. The payoff for the principal was the stake back plus 1 times the stake. If either of the 2 numbers came up, the stake was returned. The gambling establishment derived its income from a 10% levy on winnings. This apart, was it a fair game? It seems so. Writing S for stake, we have for the 4 options the following expectations. 1. 1 over 4 times 4s equals 1s. 2. 1 over 4 times 3s plus 1 over 4 times 1s equals 1s. 3. 1 over 4 times 2s plus 1 over 4 times 2s equals 1s. 4. 1 over 4 times 2s plus 1 over 4 times 1s plus 1 over 4 times 1s equals 1s. Computer simulation and analysis both show that the debarred betting options do not affect fairness. The number of coins drawn has a slight effect on the frequency of the 4 possible moduli, but simulation shows this can be virtually eliminated by requiring that the number of cash drawn falls within a reasonable range, such as 31 to 98. In 10 to the power 7 trials for this range, all 4 moduli appeared at a frequency of 2.5 times 10 to the power 6. How far probabilistic thinking was needed to construct this game is an open question. It may have been enough to see that, given equal probability of outcomes, the bettor's net gains and losses sum to 0 for each of the 4 betting patterns. These may be expressed as the cyclical groups formed from -1, -1, -1 plus 3, -1, -1, 0 plus 2, and -1, -1 plus 2, 0, -1, -1 plus 1 plus 1, and -1, 0 plus 1, 0 respectively. Note, this reconstruction is a compromise based on conflicting accounts in Kuo and Shao 1995 and Lo and Shui 1994. See Elvin 2000 for the details, and Xu Xia Qi, page 157, for the earlier history. End of box. Finally, aleatoric technology was to a surprising degree shared between the Chinese and European and other major Old World cultures after about 600, though not completely. Games like backgammon and dominoes travelled back and forth. The first, for example, went to China, and the second came from it. The correct solutions to problems involving probabilities had therefore to be essentially identical in both cultures, though full precision in matching stakes and odds was not always necessary if one side, like a gaming house, had the institutional power to impose a margin in its favour. Those who got the sums wrong lost money in both cultures. The well-known problem of the difficulty in transferring skills needed for the successful replication of technical results does not arise. The basic criteria for minimal comparability are thus met, as is the criterion of a similar definition of success. The concept of fully separate Chinese and European cultural domains cannot be sustained in this area, which is what gives it much of its theoretical interest. Subheading: Possible futures. So all-embracing is the intellectual tapestry woven over 50 years in the volumes of Science and Civilization in China, ranging from the particularities of tradesmen's tools to the vast generalities that sustain the pre-modern Chinese versions of theories of everything, that it is hard to resist the question, what remains to be done, apart from supplementing, correcting, fine-tuning, and reinterpreting? Note: An example of the need for fine-tuning arises from the divergence of views between Dieter Kuhn, the author of Science and Civilization in China, Volume 5, Part 9, 1988, pages 225 to 236, and the present author in Elvin, 1972, on the most plausible reconstruction of the water-powered spinning machines described by Wang Chen early in the 14th century. My reply to Kuhn appears on pages 60 to 63 of Elvin, 1996, and highlights distinctive strengths and weaknesses in the two versions. Notably, Kuhn adheres to the proportions given in Wang's text, but pays no attention to the best iconographic tradition with which these are not consistent. My version, validated by professional spinning engineers as workable, is based on the superior images and matches each item depicted, but does not have Kuhn's scrupulous correspondence with the text. Both versions, however, require assumptions justified neither in the text nor the images in order to work, but make different choices. It would seem that the experimental reconstruction and testing of a range of close to full-scale working models is called for if the analysis is to be carried forward. End of note. Thanks first and foremost to Wang Ling's 11 years as Needham's first research assistant. The project long ago identified the majority of the major texts, even if much work has still to be undertaken on them. Note: see Needham's characteristically generous acknowledgement of Wang Ling's first 7 years on page 14 of Science and Civilization of China, Volume 1. It was only recently, when beginning to work through Wang Ling's papers and library in Canberra, courtesy of Mrs. Ruth Wang, that I realized how much of the bibliography of secondary works in Science and Civilization in China was also likely to have been due to Ling's indefatigable truffle hunting. End of note. This aside, it might seem that what is left to be attempted is mostly to trawl a vaster ocean of less familiar literature and less densely distributed materials, Cetacean style, for intellectual nourishment and perhaps occasional trouvailles. Thus the publication of what is formally the final volume in the survey of the history of Chinese science undertaken by Needham and his collaborators is an appropriate moment to ask, is this impression justified? If not, where can substantive research advance next? I say substantive, as re-evaluation and criticism have of course been going on since the 1950s. Note: for references to the older literature, see the references in Elvin, Peterson, Librecht and Cullen, 1980. End of note. In recent years, French scholars in particular have been at the forefront of offering a different perspective on many parts of the field, as well as important new contributions in fields such as mathematics and botany. Note, see the Revue d'Histoire des Sciences 42 for 1989 and 43 1 1990. The francophone Swiss sinologist Jean-François Billetet and his colleagues have also launched a plausible and provocative attack on the view of Needham and his collaborators that Shen Kuo can be sensibly conceptualized as a scientist. Note, Billetet et al. 1993, end of note. If tenable, this key case implies a need to re-examine many of the assumptions built into the language that we have grown accustomed to using. The present introduction is not the place for a critique of these criticisms. The developing polyphony of multiple voices, whether one always agrees with them or not, is, however, an enrichment of the field to be cherished. Like the journal Chinese Science, now re-entitled East Asian Science, Technology and Medicine, it bespeaks its continuing vitality. It is unlikely that these responses and initiatives would have existed but for Needham's volumes to provoke them. Many recent scholars who have to some degree taken issue with Needham's views have in fact gone generously out of their way to acknowledge this debt. Note, notable examples are Cullen, 1977, and Librecht, 1973, end of note. The only partially parallel sources of inspiration during the appropriate period were Japanese. The rich anthologies on aspects of the history of science and technology in China in various periods, inspired and edited by the late Yabuuchi Kiyoshi. Note, sometimes written Yabuichi Kiyoshi. End of note. Though these are slightly later than Needham's earlier work, they have to a large extent overlapped with it chronologically. Note, for a full bibliography of Yabuuti's publications, see Togo, 2002. End of note. Being of a more restricted scope, however, it seems fair to say that they did not present a comparable challenge to existing paradigms in the history of science. I would identify three domains that seem to me to be promising for future substantive work. It is certain that many readers can think of others. The first domain is probabilistic thinking, already touched on above and illustrated in the accompanying box. The reader will have seen from this that, at least in a context such as this one, Needham sometimes criticized custom of thinking in terms of an ultimately universal modern science cannot, perhaps surprisingly, be faulted. The second is scientific knowledge in action in specific environments, drawing mainly on the Chinese sources for local history, which are particularly rich for the late imperial age. In no other area is the unsatisfactory nature of drawing a sharp as opposed to what might be called a blurred distinction between science and technology so evident. Conceptual understanding of how a landscape worked regularly informed pre-modern Chinese actions to transform it or control it or restore it. Note, there are examples in several of the chapters in Elvin and Liu, 1998, notably those by Vermeer, Osborne, Will, and Elvin and Su. End of note. This was evident, for example, in the interplay between hydrological and hydraulic theorizing on the one hand and hydraulic practice on the other. Irrigation systems, flood control, drainage, and seawall construction had a large rule of thumb component, but especially as regards how it was thought that water behaved and sediment was deposited or entrained, there was, over more than a millennium, a vigorously debated component of theory, and more than just theory constantly tested in practice. There is a slightly Brahminical disdain among some of those scholars concerned with the history of the higher sciences towards early attempts to make rational sense of such rough and ready complex phenomena as moving water, mud, earth, erosion, and vegetation cover. It is true, of course, that the results were rarely clear-cut, and empirical art and experience could sometimes win out for a time over theoretical understanding. Effective action in this context is commonly required more than comprehension in the abstract, especially at the beginning. To give an example, Su Ninghu and I pointed out some time ago that although Fan Chi Shun in the 16th century had grasped that the celerity of a moving current determines its capacity to transport suspended sediment, this did not mean that Fan's attempt to use this correct principle to clear the silted up lower reaches of the southern course Yellow River by concentrating them in a single channel and then narrowing this channel was wholly successful. Note, Vermeer 1987, end of note. In particular, while doing this shifted an enormous volume of sediment, he overlooked that since the speed of the current slowed as it approached the sea, the suspended materials would be largely dropped again, creating a barrier across the sea mouth. Note, Elvin and Sue, 1998, pages 401 to 405, end of note. In 1593, he was replaced by the more traditional and pragmatic Yang Yi-Hui, who did the best he could to undo the damage, though only with limited success. Even accepting that there is thus a gross and approximative aspect to most early Chinese environmental science, it seems difficult to deny it the label of science. To give just one example, following on from Fan's case, by the first half of the 19th century, we can find a clear understanding that as a current slowed, it progressively dropped its suspended sediments in a sequence from the heavier and larger to the lighter and smaller particles, beginning with stones and gravels, then sands, then silts, and finally clays. In terms of mean diameters, this covers approximately 4 orders of magnitude, from centimeters down to microns. As an illustration, we may take some passages from the mid-19th century local gazetteer for Tengchuan Department, which lay at the northern end of the Erhai Lake in Yunnan. They describe the works undertaken each year on the Michu River. Note, Tengchuan Chou Chi, 1854 to 1855, pages 79 to 80. End of note. In late imperial times, this river was seen as a lesser counterpart of the Yellow River, as it carried so much sediment that the first part of its lower course below the Fu To Gorge on the department border ran and still runs in dikes above the level of the rooftops of the houses alongside it, and its debouchement into the Erhai has recently built up an extended lacustrine delta. The passage shows not only the good general understanding of fluvial geomorphology, but even a rough notion of cross-channel helical flow at bends. After a description of the way in which the river, as its speed decreased, steadily dropped its sediment load in order of decreasing side, it concluded, "One can test this point when the water is dried up in the spring and winter. If one looks at the riverbed, it consists of large stones squatting in the upper reaches and fragmented stones arranged in graded order in the sections that follow. The accumulated sediments and piled up pebbles are in continuous succession, subdivided ever more finely." End quote. Though not modern in the sense of not being precisely quantified or based on systematic mensuration, the sharpness of perception in these hydrological and hydraulic observations is impressive. What is especially interesting, though, is that they were put to practical use. In the later 18th and the early 19th centuries, on the west side of the upper Michu River, just above the Fu To Gorge, large amounts of sediments were intermittently washed off the mountain slopes by the wet season rains, once these slopes had begun to be cleared for farming in the 18th century. They came down a large and normally dry valley called the Paihan into the river gorge, where they choked it, causing backflooding of farmland and houses. The solution developed was to divert the flash floods, with the heavy loads of stones and gravels, along an extended and almost level deposition service, walled off from the direct course into the river by what was called a dry cross-dike. As the current slowed, the heavier sediments were dropped on this surface, and the next heaviest then further filtered by a low barrier planted with trees. Only after this was the water, now carrying only a suspension of fine sediment, redirected into the river. This was informed and deliberate engineering. The elevated causeway that has been built up by years of repeated spate-season depositions is today of massive size, and the deposited large-diameter sediments are quarried by the locals in the dry period for gravel. What is interesting about it is the successful application in practice of a hydraulic principle derived from careful local observation. It is my impression that a large quantity of historical material of this sort remains as yet little explored in local gazetteers and analogous works. Apart from hydraulics, some of the topics that might repay investigation are botanical and zoological observations and attempts to explain unusual local phenomena. An example of this last, from the 13th century, is Chu Chungyu's construction of a flume as an experimental model, in which he tried to reproduce the tidal bore in his native Hangzhou Bay. Note, see Elvin and Sue, 1988, pages 369 to 370, end of note. At best, he seems to have confused a hydraulic jump, which may have been what he produced, or at worst just turbulence due to a rough surface, with the bore effect, which is a hydrological analogue to a sonic boom. But the idea and his description of it are worth noting. The style of scientific thinking that Crombie labelled hypothetical modelling had a real, if tenuous, place in medieval Chinese culture. The third is the hazier topic of the changing mindset of the elite. Hazy but important. There are prima facie grounds, for example, for suspecting that the late imperial age saw a disenchantment of the world. Note, Max Weber's Entzauberung. I first noticed this when I found that the miracles associated with the fidelity of widows, whose brief biographies are recorded in immense numbers in local gazetteers, declined precipitously from the Ming to the Qing. See Elvin, 1996, Chapter 10, end of note. That is, a trend towards seeing fewer dragons and miracles, not unlike the disenchantment that began to spread across the Europe of the Enlightenment, but without an accelerating science either, as a cause or a consequence. The same phenomenon of a weaker but non-existent Chinese parallel with Europe can be found in the domain of fashion. It used to be thought that the intensifying passion for continual change in early modern Europe, visible not only in shifting styles of personal clothing, but in most of the arts, had no Chinese parallel. This too has been found to be too extreme a contrast. Fashion in women's clothes, known as shifeng, trends of the times, was a feature of Shanghai, for example, in the later 19th century. Note, Elvin, 1999, pages 152 to 3, end of note. The analytical issue here, too, is dissolving into a question of different degrees and becoming correspondingly hard to handle satisfactorily. Subheading, the present volume. Needham never solved the Needham problem, nor has anyone else to date, at least in any fashion that commands general acceptance. In part, this is because it coexists in an ambiguous relationship with a counterpart, which may be called for convenience the Weber problem. But why did China not create its own endogenous industrial capitalism? Note, see Elvin, 1984 and 1988, end of note. The two questions are evidently interrelated, but the conceptual frameworks with which the specialists approach them are usually significantly different. Even the most polymathic and penetrating in one of these worlds of thought, and Needham was certainly among the most deservingly celebrated of this number, tend to use oversimplified or somewhat dated ideas from the other world. Perhaps Needham's most favoured magic variable for explaining the relative acceleration of science in early modern Europe was the rise of the bourgeoisie. But recent work on this area by economic and political historians has made this concept ever more elusive. Note: summarised at various points in Goldstone, 1991. A more subtle variant of Needham's position may be found in Vale 2000, page 18. End of note. One could even argue, polemically but to make a point, that one of the many factors that distinguished early modern Western Europe from late imperial China was precisely the perduring in Europe of a relatively independent aristocracy. Just as one could also argue, equally polemically but likewise to make a point, that the Roman Catholic Church has long outlasted any comparably identifiable Chinese institution, and was no less capable of mobilizing talent from the lower levels of society than the Mandarinate. Changeless Europe? No, hardly, but we accept the old clichés too easily. Conversely, Ken Pomerantz's challenging work, The Great Divergence, China, Europe and the Making of the Modern World Economy, note, Pomerantz 2000, bypasses science as an area deserving of attention. Note, see my review in the China Quarterly, September 2001. End of note. Effecting an organic conjunction of the two discourses is difficult, and a task still for the future. Most of the chapters of the present volume record one or another of Needham's approaches to the Needham volume, and they were originally formulated at a time when hardly anyone else in the world was aware of the problem, let alone wrestling with attempted solutions. It is difficult to be one step ahead of the game, and dauntingly so to be 2 steps ahead, as he was for a number of years. They remain, without exaggeration, a heroic legacy, and are still capable of inspiring. This is why they are printed here, even if at moments, to speak honestly, they can also now seem naive or infuriating. I doubt, for example, if many serious economic historians of China would today see the economy of the Song and later times as having been, in the majority of the centuries that followed, seriously undermonetized. Needham was supremely sensitive to the issue of the later near standstill raised by China's achievements in technology and the sciences up to about 1600, but was much less sensitive than he perhaps should have been to the parallel economic aspect of the problem, that China was in many ways economically up with or even ahead of Europe for quite some time after this, as correctly stressed by Pomerantz, among others. The problem is thus harder than Needham thought, and probably than most of us like to think even now. It requires not only the organic joining of the history of science and technology with the history of the economy and society referred to above, but also abandoning the ever-tempting and easily acquired habit of attributing virtually unchanging cultural characteristics to China and Europe as the key to discriminating between them over the long run. This erroneous habit of thought amounts to implying that because China was this and Europe was that, in all but perpetuity everything else followed. In other terms, relying on some version of Weber's ideal types. What is, per contra, needed is a history focusing on changing conjunctures. Note, see Elvin 1984, especially page 103, end of note. Since the minimum required, as Needham himself came to emphasize, is the explanation of, seen from the Chinese side, a relative advance followed by a relative retardation, and this, so easy to specify in the abstract, is hard to deliver convincingly in practice. What Science and Civilization in China still has to effect, and why it is still so vital, is the creation of an awareness in every historian of science that no new idea about the origins of modern science in Western Europe should have droit de cité until it has been tested against the Chinese case to see if it effects a discrimination that is both precise and relevant. William Amon's wonderfully rich Science and the Secrets of Nature is a good example. Note, Amon, 1994, End of note. The argument is too complex for summary here, but he suggests 2 points, which he relates directly to the genesis of modern science, that can be taken on their own without serious injustice. The first is that conception of nature as a repository of decipherable secrets derived from a strand of Islamic tradition was a powerful stimulus to late medieval experimental science in the West, most notably for Roger Bacon in the 13th century. The second derives from his exploration of the early modern vulgarization, in its good sense, that led to a barrage of how-to-do-it manuals, the disenchantment of technology, and a mediation between elite natural philosophy and the people's immediate empirical experience of nature. Note, I bid, pages 113 and 105, end of note. It seems likely that Chinese alchemy, older than its Western counterpart, can broadly match the first, and that the approximately millennial tradition of Chinese printed how-to-do-it books on farming and crafts, though probably not so easily accessible to the only modestly literate, offers at least a partial parallel to the second. Thus, the effect in a context was probably what was crucial, and most awaits definition. Most tantalizing, though, is the refinement Eamon implicitly gives to Needham's famous summing up, namely that in pre-modern China, science and technology reached the level of Da Vinci but not of Galileo. His research has brought out of the shadows the late 16th century European concern with natural magic, and especially that of Della Porta, who wrote the best-known contemporary book on the subject. Note, see I bid, Chapter 6, Natural Magic and the Secrets of Nature. End of note. This, however, had much in common with the tastes of at least some important Chinese intellectuals at the same time. In the 1,000 or so pages of Sher Chao-Che's fivefold miscellany, published in 1608, one finds an analogous mixture of rational analysis and breathtaking fantasy, a similar obsession with the marvellous and exceptional, the same interweaving of grand metaphysics with bizarre trivia, an identical relish in explaining or unmasking technical trickery, including the alleged role of demons, and a parallel alternation of sound observation and testing in practice, with the blithe acceptance of the unverified and unverifiable. Note, Elvin, 1993 to 1994. End of note. When Eamon says that Della Porta's empiricism was not some proto-Baconian inductivism, but history and literature verified by experience, note Eamon 1994, page 216, end of note, he unknowingly encapsulates Scheck's thinking with equal accuracy. Differences there were, too. Of these, the most important and least remarked upon may have been the stronger European sense that all of this mattered. But how the flower of science grew from one heap of intellectual compost and not from the other needs more discriminating analysis than Eamon, or anyone yet, offers. This is symbolized by the delicate but critical shift around in 1611 on the part of the still youthful Academia de Lincei, away from its esotericism and its preoccupation with natural secrets. Note, I bid, page 231. This was caused in the immediate sense, as he recounts, by the replacement of the dominant influence of its fifth member to join by that of its sixth. The Magus Della Porta was the fifth member, and the sixth, one of the first scientists conventionally accepted as modern, a certain Galileo Galilei. Thus the Chinese case shows up, as perhaps nothing else can, how our subject lives on a knife edge. A final point. I have written Needham at most places in this introduction, aware that on many occasions it should have been at the very least Needham et al. Joseph had a remarkable core band of collaborators. They ranged from the Chinese students who first sparked his interest in Chinese science, one of whom was Lu Guizhen, the biologist, and the most important of them all over the long run, through Wang Ling, who laid the sinological foundations, and Nathan Sivin, who gave new dimensions to the discourse, down to Kenneth Robinson, whose contribution figures prominently in the present volume, as well as those who have continued to care for his legacy at the Needham Research Institute. Outstanding among these are Ho Peng-Yok, both a major contributor in his own right, and the former director, who has long piloted the ship through difficult times, and Christopher Cullen, the former deputy director and now director, and an expert in the history of Chinese cosmography and mathematics. Specific tribute should also be paid to Sir Brian Pippard, FRS, who for a time chaired the executive committee, and to Sir Geoffrey Lloyd, who served as chair of the Board of Trustees. There have been many, many others who I hope will forgive my not mentioning them individually here, especially those who authored some of the later individual volumes. All of them are scholars who are, or for those no longer with us were, distinguished in their own right. Perhaps the greatest tribute of all to the compelling power of Needham's vision is that people of such quality have felt honoured and enriched to spend a substantial part of their creative lives as part of the collective enterprise he created. Mark Elvin.